Story number 1. The Hunter's Eyes. Matt Turner had never been good at running from his past, but this time, after losing his wife in a car accident, he had no choice. He packed up what was left of their things, loaded them into the truck, and drove west as far as he could go. The road stretched endlessly ahead, offering a semblance of escape in the vast emptiness of the desert. His daughter, Emily, was quiet beside him, her small hands gripping the window, her face pale, her eyes distant. She hadn't spoken much since the accident, and Matt didn't know what to say to her. So they just drove. When they found the little town of Morrow, a place Matt had never heard of, it seemed to promise the peace they both needed. The house they rented was small, nestled on the edge of town, with nothing but desert and rugged hills surrounding it. The air smelled like dust and heat, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, as if the world had forgotten it existed. At first, everything felt like it was going to be okay. They unpacked their belongings, and Emily spent her days exploring the dry landscape, collecting rocks and sticks, and drawing in her sketchbook. Matt tried to work from home, but the silence of the house weighed heavily on him, and the memories of his wife lingered in every corner. It wasn't until Emily started talking about the legend that Matt began to feel the shift in the air. "There's a man out there," she told him one evening, her voice soft, as though she were afraid of speaking too loudly. "He can change into anything, into anyone." Matt looked up from his paperwork, his gaze flicking to his daughter. "What do you mean, a man who can change into anyone?" She nodded, her eyes wide. "A Skinwalker," she whispered. "They say he lives in the hills." Matt chuckled lightly, though a chill ran down his spine. "You're imagining things, kiddo. There's no such thing as Skinwalkers." But Emily wasn't so sure. She spent the next few days asking the townspeople about it. Each one gave a nervous smile, a hurried dismissal, or a change of subject. But Emily persisted. She was drawn to the myth, to the creature that could shed its skin and take the shape of anything it desired. Matt, too, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The people in Morrow were strange, too quiet, too watchful. He saw the same faces everywhere, always with that unsettling smile, that strange gleam in their eyes. The kind of look that made you feel as though they were waiting for something, for someone. Then, the dreams began. At first, they were faint, just flickers of images. He saw shadows moving in the corners of his vision, faces that seemed familiar but wrong. He'd wake in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, the remnants of the dreams slipping away like sand through his fingers. But one night, he awoke to the sound of something scratching at the window. When he looked outside, he saw nothing but the dark, vast desert. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. The next morning, Emily was different. Her eyes were wide and restless, her movements more erratic. She seemed to know things about the people in town, about their habits, their routines. She spoke of them as if she had known them her entire life. "You should see them," she said one evening. "They're not who they seem. The Skinwalker has taken them." Matt's heart raced. "What are you talking about? Who?" "The old man who owns the store, the woman who lives next door. They're all the same. He's in them, all of them." Matt tried to calm her, but the more he tried, the more she seemed to slip away from him, like sand through his fingers. He needed to understand. He went to the town's library, searching for any old records, any sign of the myth that had entranced his daughter. What he found shocked him. There were stories, old, handwritten accounts of strange disappearances, of people who came to Morrow and never left, their faces fading from memory, their names slipping from history. All of them were tied to the legend of the Skinwalker. The creature had been said to be a part of this town, a force so insidious it had become one with the land, with the people. And now it was after them. That night, Matt stayed awake, watching his daughter as she slept fitfully, murmuring in her sleep, her body twitching as though she were trapped in a nightmare. It wasn't just her dreams that were changing. There was something more, something darker. As the days passed, he began to see it too. The residents, their faces too still, their eyes too knowing. He saw the old man from the store again, but this time the skin on his face seemed to ripple, shifting in the light. Matt could feel it. The presence of something ancient, something evil, lurking just beneath the surface of everything. The Skinwalker had already found them. Matt knew what he had to do. He couldn't let his daughter fall prey to this creature. He couldn't let the thing that had haunted their family, this curse, this evil, take root again. He went to the hills, to the place where the creature was said to live, armed with nothing but his fear and his determination. He didn't know how to fight a shapeshifter, how to stop something that could be anyone. But he knew one thing: the eyes. The eyes never lied. As he climbed the rocky terrain, the air grew heavier and the shadows stretched longer, pulling at him like 1,000 unseen hands. He saw the faces again, those same eyes, those same people, but they weren't real. The eyes were cold, empty, hungry. Then, out of the darkness, the Skinwalker appeared. It was a man, but not a man. His face was familiar, twisted into the shape of someone Matt once knew. His wife, maybe, or someone else from his past. But the eyes were the same. Those eyes that had haunted him, that had followed him since the accident. Matt lunged, desperate to protect Emily, to destroy the creature before it could do any more harm. The battle was brief. The creature wasn't just a monster, it was everything. The town, the people, the land. It was a living nightmare, a thing that wore the faces of those it consumed. And as Matt stood over it, panting and bruised, he realized there was no escaping it. The Skinwalker would always be there, waiting, watching. Because it wasn't just a creature of flesh, it was a creature of memory, of loss, of regret. And the worst part was, it had Emily's eyes. Story number 2. The Last Witness. Deputy Jack Grayson stood on the outskirts of Oak Hollow, staring at the crime scene. The rancher's body lay sprawled across the dirt, blood staining the earth around him in a grotesque pattern. Jack had seen his fair share of violence, but this was different. There was something unsettling about it. The brutality of the attack, the way the body was left, it didn't sit right with him. His boots crunched on the gravel as he approached the body. The rancher's face was twisted in terror, his eyes wide open as if he had seen something horrific before he died. Jack knelt beside the corpse, scanning the area for any signs of struggle. Nothing seemed out of place, except the unease that lingered in the air. It felt wrong, unnatural. Jack had grown up in Oak Hollow, a sleepy town where nothing much happened. Sure, there were the occasional petty crimes, drunk drivers, the odd fight at the local bar. But murder? It was unheard of. And now, just like that, one of their own had been slaughtered, left to rot in the dirt as if he was nothing more than an animal. "What do you think, Jack?" Officer Hernandez asked, her voice trembling with nerves as she stood a few paces behind him. Jack didn't answer immediately. His mind was racing. There was something off about the whole scene, something that didn't match the way a typical murder unfolded. The brutality was savage, sure, but there were no signs of a struggle. It was almost as if the rancher had been overpowered by something powerful. "I don't know," he muttered, standing up and glancing around. The sun had already dipped behind the horizon, leaving the land in shadows. The air felt heavy, like a storm was about to break. But I intend to find out. The investigation that followed didn't help ease Jack's growing sense of dread. The town was small, and word spread fast. People were scared. The whispers started almost immediately. Rumors of strange occurrences, of things that couldn't be explained. They spoke of animals behaving oddly, of sightings of figures in the woods, and of eerie sounds echoing through the night. But the worst of it was the stories about the Skinwalker. It was an old legend, something Jack had heard when he was a kid but had long since dismissed. The Skinwalker was said to be a shape-shifting creature, a being that could take the form of any living creature, animal, or human. It was said to be a force of evil, a predator that hunted those who crossed its path, leaving only death in its wake. But now, with the body count starting to rise and the townspeople growing more fearful by the day, Jack couldn't shake the thought that there might be more truth to the story than he was willing to believe. As the investigation deepened, Jack found evidence that pointed to something much darker than he could have ever imagined. Old journals, hidden in the rancher's cabin, told of ancient rituals practiced by the native people long before Oak Hollow was founded. The rituals were designed to summon and control creatures, forces that were neither human nor animal, but something in between. Jack didn't know what to make of it. But the more he read, the more certain he became that whatever was hunting the town was not human. It wasn't just a serial killer. It was something far worse. The creature, whatever it was, had been lurking in the shadows for centuries. And now it was active again, feeding on the fear and death it caused. As Jack dug deeper, he began to uncover more disturbing truths. The town of Oak Hollow wasn't just a place where people lived. It was a battleground. A place where an ongoing war was being waged between forces that wanted to protect humanity and those that sought to destroy it. The Skinwalker was only one part of it. It was a small but significant piece of a larger, more sinister puzzle. And Jack was caught in the middle of it. With each passing day, the danger grew. The attacks became more frequent, the deaths more brutal. People in town started to disappear, and whispers of the creature's return grew louder. There was a sense of unease in the air, as if something was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jack knew he had to act. But the more he learned, the more he realized that stopping the creature would require more than just brute force. It would require understanding the ancient rituals, learning how to fight something that wasn't bound by the rules of humanity. It would require him to face a reality he wasn't ready for. A reality where monsters weren't just stories told around a campfire, but living, breathing horrors. And worst of all, it would require him to confront the truth that the creature was already among them. One night, after a particularly brutal attack, Jack followed a lead that took him into the woods. His flashlight flickered as he trudged through the underbrush, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him, that he wasn't alone. And then he saw it. A pair of eyes, glowing in the darkness. They watched him, unblinking, unfeeling. And in those eyes, Jack saw the truth. The Skinwalker had been here for much longer than anyone realized. It had been watching them, biding its time. The war was about to escalate, and Jack knew that he was the last witness. He was the only one left who could stop it. But as the creature stepped out from the shadows, its shape shifting, its face changing, Jack realized something else. There was no going back. He wasn't just fighting to protect his town anymore. He was fighting for his life. Story number 3. The Shape of Fear. Maggie Turner had always believed that running away could offer a fresh start, a chance to escape the darkness that followed her. After everything that happened, losing her family in that car accident, the haunting memories, the guilt, She needed to be somewhere no one knew her, somewhere she could be alone. The small cabin in the mountains, miles from the nearest town, seemed perfect. The kind of place where the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. She arrived on a cool autumn evening, the sun dipping below the horizon as the trees swayed in the wind. Maggie unpacked her things slowly, taking in the solitude, letting the silence wash over her. The cabin was cozy, simple. A small kitchen, a bedroom with a large window that looked out onto the dense forest, and a living room with a stone fireplace. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of peace. But that night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she felt something shift. Her body felt restless, as if the cabin, the very land beneath it, was alive. A low whisper seemed to hum in the air, though Maggie couldn't pinpoint its source. She tried to shake the feeling off, convincing herself it was just nerves. The silence here had to be different from the chaos of the city. She was just adjusting. It didn't take long for the dreams to start. The first one was simple enough. She was standing in a field, bathed in moonlight. The air was cold, but she wasn't afraid. In fact, she felt calm. But when she looked down, she didn't see her own hands. Instead, there were long, claw-like fingers, the skin pale and stretched tight over bone. Her heart raced as she tried to move, but her body felt foreign, wrong. Then, a voice echoed through the air, low and familiar. "You are one of us now." Maggie woke with a start, her pulse pounding in her ears. Her hands trembled as she clutched the blankets, the memory of the dream lingering like a fog. It was just a dream, she told herself. A manifestation of stress, maybe, but it didn't feel like that. It felt too real. Over the next few days, the dreams came more frequently, each one more vivid than the last. In one, she was standing before a massive stone altar, surrounded by figures cloaked in shadow. Their faces were obscured, but she could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their gaze pressing down like a physical force. The whispers grew louder, chanting in an ancient tongue she couldn't understand but somehow knew. And in the distance, a shape, tall, twisted, loomed over her, its eyes glowing with hunger. Maggie woke up gasping for air, drenched in sweat, her heart hammering against her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that these dreams were more than just her subconscious trying to process her trauma. It was as if they were calling to her, guiding her toward something dark and dangerous. By the end of the week, Maggie couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. The dreams weren't just dreams anymore. They had started bleeding into her waking life. She would catch glimpses of things out of the corner of her eye, shadows moving unnaturally, figures watching her from the trees. But when she turned to look, there was nothing there. And then, one evening, she saw something that stopped her heart. She was walking to the cabin's porch when she saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching her. Its face was hidden in shadow, but there was something in the way it stood, something predatory. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. She took a step forward, but before she could get closer, the figure disappeared into the trees, as if it had melted into the darkness. The next morning, Maggie found something strange in the yard. An old, weathered symbol etched into the ground, a circle with intricate lines crisscrossing through it. It looked almost ritualistic. She knelt down, her fingers grazing the rough edges of the markings, a sense of recognition stirring deep within her chest. It was a symbol she had seen before in her dreams. That's when it hit her. The dreams, the symbols, the figure in the trees, they weren't random. They were connected to her past, to something ancient that had been waiting for her. The Skinwalkers. She had heard stories of them growing up. creatures that could take the form of any living thing, shape-shifting beings that had once walked the earth with powers beyond human comprehension. They were creatures of darkness, bound by ancient rites and rituals, and they had been feared for centuries. But Maggie never thought they were real. Until now. As the days wore on, the dreams became more insistent. She began to see herself, not as Maggie, but as someone else. Someone who had lived before. Someone who had walked the earth long ago. She saw glimpses of a woman, her face, but not her face, standing in a circle of fire, her hands raised in a gesture of power. She saw herself as a part of something dark, something evil. The whispers returned, louder this time. "You are one of us." Maggie tried to fight it. She tried to tell herself that it wasn't real, that she was just losing her mind, but deep down, she knew the truth. She wasn't just running from her past, she was running from something far worse. The Skinwalkers had marked her, and they were coming for her. As the sun set on her final night in the cabin, Maggie made a decision. She couldn't run anymore. She had to face what she was, what she had been. She couldn't let the Skinwalkers claim her completely. She had to break the cycle. With the symbols glowing faintly in the air around her, Maggie stepped into the forest, ready to confront the truth about her past life and the terrifying force that had shaped her future. The wind howled, and the darkness stretched before her like an endless void, but she stepped forward, determined to survive. The shape of fear was real, but so was her will to fight it. Story number 4. The Eyes of the Beast. Darren and Lisa had hoped that the mountain lodge would give them the chance to reconnect. Their marriage had been strained for months. Distant arguments, the kind of silence that fills a house but leaves nothing spoken. A week in the remote mountains seemed like just what they needed. A quiet, peaceful retreat away from the distractions of everyday life. Just the two of them, surrounded by nothing but trees and fresh air. The lodge was rustic, built with heavy wooden beams and large windows that overlooked the dense forest below. The view was breathtaking, a vast sea of pines stretching as far as the eye could see. It was perfect, isolated, peaceful, untouched. But as soon as they arrived, something felt off. Darren noticed it first as they were unpacking the car. The air was heavy, thick with something he couldn't quite place. The mountain seemed too quiet, too still. There were no birds singing, no animals scurrying in the underbrush. Just an unsettling silence that stretched out around them, like the world had stopped breathing. Lisa, too, felt it. She stood by the door, her arms crossed over her chest, staring into the trees. "It's kind of eerie, isn't it?" she asked, her voice uncertain. Darren nodded, trying to shake off the sense of unease. "It's probably just the altitude," he said, attempting to sound convincing. "We're not used to being this high up." That night, they sat by the fireplace, enjoying the warmth of the flames as they tried to relax. But as darkness fell over the lodge, things started to feel even stranger. At first, it was just the sounds of the woods, an occasional snap of a twig, the rustling of leaves, the howling of a distant wind. But then came the growls. Deep, guttural growls that seemed to come from the forest surrounding the lodge. Lisa looked at Darren, her face pale, her lips trembling. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Darren frowned. "It's probably just an animal, maybe a wolf or a bear, but the growls didn't stop. They came in waves, low and menacing, and as the night wore on, they grew closer. The air around the cabin felt heavier, like it was pressing in on them, suffocating them. The growls were joined by something else. Faint, eerie whispers, like voices carried on the wind. The next morning, Darren went outside to investigate, hoping to clear his mind. The woods were quiet again, too quiet. The trees were dense, their branches twisted and gnarled, casting long shadows across the forest floor. As he walked deeper into the woods, he noticed something strange. A trail of broken branches and footprints in the dirt, too large to be from any animal he knew. He turned to head back to the lodge, but as he did, he saw something move in the distance. A shadow, fleeting but unmistakable. It was there one moment and gone the next, vanishing into the trees. Darren's heart pounded as he hurried back to the cabin, but the feeling of being watched stayed with him. That afternoon, Lisa and Darren decided to take a hike, hoping to shake off the tension that had begun to build between them. As they walked along the narrow mountain trail, the sense of unease returned. It wasn't just the silence this time, it was the feeling of being followed. When they paused to catch their breath, they heard it. Footsteps behind them, matching their pace, as if someone, or something, was walking just out of sight. They quickened their pace, but the footsteps kept coming, always just out of reach. Finally, they reached a clearing and stopped to rest, only to find something far more disturbing than they had expected. Hidden beneath a thick layer of moss and vines was an ancient cave entrance, barely visible in the shadows. The air around it felt cold, the temperature dropping sharply as they drew closer. Inside the cave, the walls were covered in strange symbols and animal bones, arranged in eerie patterns. There was an overwhelming sense of death in the air, like something had been there long before them, something dark and ancient. Lisa recoiled. "What is this place?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Darren didn't answer. He stepped further into the cave, his flashlight illuminating more bones, more symbols etched into the stone. And then he saw it. At the far end of the cave, there was a large, dark shape. Something moving. The growls from the night before echoed in his mind, and suddenly he knew they weren't alone. The Skinwalker, whatever it was real, and it had been watching them. "We need to leave," Darren said, his voice tight. "Now." But as they turned to leave, they heard the footsteps again. Only this time, they were not behind them. They were all around them, closing in. The shadows deepened, and the growls grew louder, more menacing, until the air seemed to vibrate with an unnatural force. They ran, but the path seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees closing in around them, as if they were being pulled deeper into the forest. The growls were all around them now, and Darren could hear something heavy breathing behind them, too close, too real. They stumbled upon a small cabin hidden deep in the woods. Desperate for refuge, they knocked frantically on the door. When it finally opened, an old man stood there, his eyes dark and knowing. "You're too late," he said softly. "It's already chosen you." The door slammed shut before Darren or Lisa could respond, and as they turned to leave, they saw the eyes. Bright, glowing eyes staring at them from the darkness of the trees. The Skinwalker had found them. It had always been there, watching, waiting. And now, it was time for them to become a part of its curse. Story number 5. The Skinwalker's Curse. Nathan Hale had spent the last 4 years fighting wars far from home, the weight of his service pulling at him in ways he couldn't fully explain. But now, as the bus rolled through the familiar streets of his hometown, he felt the strange mix of relief and unease that only returning to the past could bring. The town was exactly how he remembered it. Quiet, small, unassuming. Nothing had changed. Except for him. The first sign that something was wrong came a week after he returned. Nathan had been getting used to civilian life again. Finding work, reconnecting with old friends, trying to make up for the lost time. But it wasn't the loud, jarring transitions that threw him off. It was the quiet things, the subtle shifts in his mood that he couldn't explain. He was becoming increasingly agitated, more prone to anger, even over the smallest things. It was as if a switch inside him had been flipped, and now every irritation felt like a brush with violence. One evening, after a disagreement with his father, Nathan stormed out of the house, feeling his fists clench at his sides. He didn't want to fight. He wasn't the type of person to lose control, but the anger felt like it was growing from the inside out, a boiling rage he couldn't stop. As he walked through the woods behind his childhood home, the trees around him seemed to pulse with something he couldn't name, something ancient and primal. He had always loved these woods. They were his sanctuary when he was young, a place of calm, a place where nothing could touch him. But now, as he walked deeper into the trees, the air felt different. Heavy, charged with an energy that made his skin crawl. His senses felt heightened, every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves making him jump. That night, he had the dream. He was running, no, more like hunting, through the wilderness, his feet pounding the earth, his body moving with a grace he couldn't recall ever having. He could smell the earth beneath him, feel the wind in his hair, hear the sounds of the forest like they were part of him. But there was something else in the dream. Something with him. Something that was hunting him, chasing him through the night. A shadow, a figure, moving too fast to see clearly. When Nathan woke up, his heart was pounding, sweat beading on his forehead. It was the second time he'd had that dream, and the more he thought about it, the more it started to feel real, like his mind was no longer in control of his own body. The dreams grew worse over the next few days. They became more vivid, more intense. He could feel himself running again, his limbs moving faster, stronger. But it wasn't just running, it was something else. A hunger. A thirst for power that he couldn't control. He would wake up, gasping for breath, his body tense, his hands clenched into fists, as though he had been fighting for his life in the night. Then came the changes in his behavior. At work, at home, everywhere he went, he could feel his anger rising. It wasn't just frustration or irritation. It was a primal, feral rage that he couldn't contain. It was as though something inside him was pushing to the surface, something he didn't want, didn't understand. He'd snap at people over small things, his words sharp and cutting, leaving him feeling disgusted with himself afterward. But it wasn't just the anger. It was the overwhelming sense of power that came with it. Every time he lost control, he felt a rush, an energy coursing through his veins, making him feel alive in a way he couldn't explain. It was intoxicating and terrifying. Nathan started to suspect that something was wrong. This wasn't him. This wasn't just the stress of adjusting to civilian life. No, this was something else. Something older, something far darker. He began to remember old stories his grandmother had told him when he was a child. Stories about a curse, about creatures that could take on the form of a person, about skinwalkers who could control minds, who could steal bodies and souls. As Nathan delved deeper into the past, he uncovered a chilling truth. The curse wasn't just something in the stories. It was real, and it had been hunting his family for generations. The curse was passed down, from father to son, mother to daughter, each generation marked by the same signs, the same violent urges, the same dreams. It was a bloodline curse, a punishment for something long forgotten. But Nathan was different. He wasn't just experiencing the symptoms. He was becoming something else. The Skinwalker wasn't just after him, it was inside him. The more he researched, the more he understood. The Skinwalker could take his form, could control his mind, bend him to its will. And it wasn't just a random creature. It had been following his bloodline, waiting for the right moment to claim him. Now, it was stronger than ever. The only way to break the curse, to stop the Skinwalker from taking him completely, was to confront it head-on, to face the evil that had been hunting his family for centuries and destroy it. But doing so would require a sacrifice, one that might cost him everything. Nathan stood at the edge of the woods one night, staring into the darkness, feeling the weight of his decision. He could feel the Skinwalker watching him, waiting for him to make his move. His hands clenched into fists, the rage inside him bubbling to the surface. He knew what he had to do. He knew what the curse demanded. It was time to face the creature that had been stalking him all his life, and to end it once and for all, even if it meant losing himself in the process. With one final, breathless step, Nathan stepped into the woods. The hunt had begun. Story number 6. The Skinwalkers of Cold Springs. It was supposed to be a simple hiking trip, a weekend getaway for a group of friends eager to escape the noise and distractions of everyday life. Cold Springs National Park was remote, untouched by civilization, and had a reputation for its pristine beauty. Emily, Kyle, Sarah, James, and Ben had been planning the trip for months, hoping to unwind, reconnect with nature, and make memories in a place that seemed far removed from the world's worries. They arrived at the park early in the morning, the sun barely peeking over the mountains as they set off on the trail. The air was fresh and crisp, the kind of mountain air that filled your lungs and made you feel alive. Laughter echoed through the trees as they hiked deeper into the wilderness, their spirits high, not a care in the world. By mid-afternoon, they had left the main trail behind, venturing into more secluded parts of the park. The path became less defined, the trees growing denser, their branches intertwining above like the fingers of some ancient, sleeping creature. That's when they started noticing the strange symbols etched into the bark of the trees. Circles with jagged lines cutting through them, crude designs that looked too deliberate to be random. "What do you think those mean?" Sarah asked, tracing one of the symbols with her finger as they passed by. "I don't know," Kyle said, looking around. "Maybe just some old markings from hikers or something." But Emily wasn't so sure. The symbols unsettled her. There was something about them, something that felt wrong. It wasn't just their strange design, it was the way the forest seemed to hold its breath when they came near. The whispering wind carried something with it, something that sounded almost like words. She shook the feeling off and tried to focus on the hike. But that night, as they set up camp, the strange feeling only grew stronger. The forest was silent, too silent. There were no animals, no birds calling, no rustling in the underbrush. Just an eerie stillness that seemed to press down on them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the camp, the first strange event happened. They were sitting around the fire, talking and laughing, when a sudden rustling in the trees caught their attention. It was loud, like something large moving through the forest. "Probably just a deer or a bear," Ben said, trying to sound confident, though his voice was shaky. But the rustling didn't stop. It grew louder, closer. Something was moving out there, and it wasn't like any animal they had ever heard. Emily stood up, straining her ears. "Did you hear that? It's not right. It sounds like footsteps." The others went quiet, listening. The sound came again. Heavy, deliberate steps crunching through the forest floor. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the edge of their camp, standing just beyond the firelight. It was tall, its form indistinct in the shadows, but what they could see was wrong. Its face, if it even had one, was obscured, like a blur of shifting shadows. The figure stepped forward, and the firelight flickered. For a brief moment, they could see its eyes, pale and wide, staring at them with a cold, predatory gaze. "Who's there?" Kyle called out, his voice barely above a whisper. There was no answer. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching them. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure disappeared into the darkness. The silence returned, but now it was even more oppressive. The wind had stopped. The trees no longer whispered. "I don't like this," Sarah said, her voice trembling. This doesn't feel right." They huddled together around the fire, the shadows stretching long and deep around them, their unease growing with every passing minute. The next day, things only got worse. As they packed up to continue their hike, Ben went missing. His tent was empty, his gear untouched, but there was no sign of him anywhere. They called out for him, searched the area, but he had vanished without a trace. "Where the hell could he have gone?" James asked, his voice rising in panic. Emily looked at the ground, seeing something she hadn't noticed before. A trail of strange footprints, not quite human. They were too large, the steps too wide apart, as if something had been stalking them. And then they heard it again. The whispers. This time, they weren't coming from the trees. They were coming from within the forest itself, like the wind was carrying voices on its back, telling them things they didn't want to hear. In the distance, they saw shadows moving among the trees, figures just out of sight, lurking, watching. One by one, they started disappearing. James was the next. Then Sarah. Each time it was the same, the whispers, the shadows closing in, and then they were gone. Emily and Kyle were left, the last two survivors of a group that had once been full of life and laughter. But now, all that was left was terror. They tried to escape, running through the woods, but the deeper they went, the more they realized they weren't being chased by mere men. The Skinwalkers had found them. The creatures had been hunting in this wilderness for centuries, their forms shifting, their minds controlling. They could take the shape of anything, anyone, and they had been waiting, biding their time until the right group of people wandered into their territory. The land was cursed, and the Skinwalkers were its true masters. As Emily and Kyle reached the edge of the park, hoping for a way out, the trees closed in on them, and the shadows that had been following them for days finally took form. The Skinwalkers stepped into the moonlight, their human faces barely masking their monstrous nature. Their eyes gleamed with hunger. Emily looked at Kyle, fear flooding her chest, but she knew it was too late. They had been marked, and now there was no escape. The last thing she heard was the whispering wind, carrying the voices of the Skinwalkers as they closed in. They had come for them all, and the wilderness would claim their souls. Story number 7. The Night Stalker Sheriff Dan Granger had seen his fair share of death in the years he'd worked in the small town of Copper Ridge, but nothing had prepared him for the string of murders that began to plague the town. It started with the discovery of a mutilated body found near the edge of the woods. The man's face was twisted in terror, his body torn apart in a way that was too brutal to be the work of any animal. No, this was something different, something darker. And it wasn't the first. Each morning, the townsfolk would wake to the news of another grisly discovery, each victim torn apart in the same brutal manner. The bodies were left scattered like pieces of a gruesome puzzle, but the killer was always elusive. The only thing they knew for sure was that something inhuman was at work. Whispers began to spread throughout Copper Ridge, voices hushed in fear as people spoke of an old legend, the Skinwalker, a shape-shifting creature that could take the form of any living thing, a monster that could slip between the shadows, unseen and undetected. It was said that the Skinwalker could control the very essence of a person, using their form for its own twisted purposes. Some even said it fed on the victims, using their bodies to build a monstrous army, a collection of souls that could be manipulated and controlled. Sheriff Granger didn't believe in old superstitions. He was a man of law, not myths. But as the bodies piled up and the town descended into a quiet panic, he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The evidence didn't add up. The killer seemed to have no motive, no connection between the victims, except that they were all from Copper Ridge, and they had all been brutally murdered in a manner that was far too precise, far too calculated. It was as though the killer knew exactly what he was doing. The sheriff spent long hours poring over the crime scenes, looking for anything that could tie the murders together. But every lead turned into a dead end. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing that could point him to the killer. The more he dug, the more frustrated he became. But it wasn't until one night, when he was called to the scene of another gruesome murder, that everything changed. The body was found deep in the woods, hidden beneath a thick layer of leaves. The victim's face was missing, the skin completely removed. There was something chilling about the way the body had been left behind, like a message. The sheriff could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end as he stared at the body, something gnawing at the pit of his stomach. As he surveyed the scene, a chill wind rustled through the trees, and Granger heard something strange. Faint whispers in the air, carried on the wind. He turned quickly, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun, but there was nothing. Just the trees, the dark wilderness stretching out into the unknown. Then, the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The whispers, the strange feeling of being watched, the cold chill in the air. It wasn't just the wind. The Skinwalker wasn't some ancient legend. It was real, and it was right here in Copper Ridge. Sheriff Granger's mind raced as he retraced his steps, piecing together the information he had. He'd been chasing a ghost, looking for a killer when the true horror lay much closer than he had ever imagined. The Skinwalker wasn't just feeding on the victims. It was using them, using their bodies to create something worse, something far worse than he could have ever imagined. The killings were part of a larger, far more horrifying plan. The Skinwalker had been slowly building an army, taking the bodies of the dead and using them as vessels, creating a twisted army of soulless, mindless creatures. And now, it was targeting Granger's town, and using the sheriff's own fears to get to him. The Skinwalker had infiltrated Copper Ridge, had become someone close to him, someone he never suspected. The sheriff's thoughts raced as he remembered the faces of the victims. It was someone in the town, someone who knew him, someone who had access to his life, his fears, someone who had been waiting for the right moment to strike. Granger felt the walls closing in around him. He couldn't trust anyone. No one was safe. The Skinwalker was among them. The next night, as Granger sat alone in his office, reviewing the case files for what felt like the 100th time, the door creaked open. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. He could feel it, like a shadow creeping into the room. It was his deputy, Carl Walker. Carl had been with Granger for years. He was a quiet man, reliable, steady, someone the sheriff trusted completely. But now, as the deputy stepped into the room, the air seemed to grow colder. Granger's pulse quickened. Something was wrong. "I need to talk to you," Carl said, his voice low and strained. Granger didn't answer. He just stared at Carl, studying his face for any sign of what he feared. Carl's eyes were dark, but there was something off about them. They weren't just tired, they were vacant, hollow. Suddenly, the deputy's lips twisted into a smile that wasn't his own, a grin that seemed far too wide, too unnatural. Granger's blood ran cold as Carl's face began to shift, the skin warping, stretching, until it wasn't Carl at all. It was something else, something monstrous. The Skinwalker. In that moment, Sheriff Granger realized the horrifying truth. The creature had been wearing Carl's face all along. It had been feeding on the fear of Copper Ridge, playing the long game, hiding in plain sight. And now, it was finally coming for him. But the sheriff wasn't ready to go down without a fight. He grabbed his gun from the desk, aiming it directly at the creature in front of him, but the Skinwalker was already moving, too fast for him to react. The last thing Granger saw was the glowing eyes of the Skinwalker, staring back at him, full of malice and hunger, before everything went black. Copper Ridge would never be the same. Story number 8. The Transformation. Dr. Andrew Carter had always been fascinated by animal behavior. As a scientist working in a remote research facility nestled in the wilderness, far from the noise of the world, he thought he had found the perfect place to study the instincts of the creatures that roamed the forest. The isolation was exactly what he needed. Peace, quiet, and a chance to focus on his work without distractions. The research facility, an old building left over from past experiments, was basic but functional. It sat on the edge of a dense forest, surrounded by rugged mountains, the kind of place where few people ever ventured. But lately, it felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. At first, everything had gone according to plan. Dr. Carter had been studying the behavior of local wildlife, deer, wolves, and smaller creatures that lived in the forest. The animals had been acting strangely, but he attributed it to the changing seasons and the pressures of the environment. However, as the days passed, he began to notice something else. Something he couldn't explain. It started with the noises. At night, when the wind howled outside and the darkness seemed to stretch endlessly, Carter would hear strange sounds coming from the woods. At first, he thought it was just the usual forest noises. A fox rustling through the underbrush, the call of an owl. But as the nights wore on, the noises grew more unsettling. Scraping sounds, deep growls, and what sounded like whispers carried on the wind. The hairs on the back of his neck would stand on end, and he would find himself scanning the shadows, half expecting to see something watching him. One morning, after a particularly sleepless night, Carter decided to investigate. He stepped outside into the brisk morning air, the ground still damp from the previous night's rain. As he walked toward the edge of the forest, something caught his eye. A set of footprints in the mud. They were large, too large for any of the local animals. And yet, they didn't look like human tracks either. The shape was off, the toes too long, the heels too narrow. His heart began to race as he followed the prints deeper into the woods. It wasn't long before Carter began to feel the sensation that he was being followed. Every step he took, every crack of a branch underfoot, seemed to echo back in a way that felt wrong, as if something, or someone, was shadowing him. He glanced over his shoulder but saw nothing, just the endless stretch of trees and undergrowth. His mind started to race. Was it a bear, a mountain lion, or something worse? The unease grew as the day wore on, and he decided to return to the safety of the facility. That night, the unease turned into full-blown paranoia. As Carter sat in his office reviewing his notes, he heard the sound of something scratching at the walls of the building. It was soft at first, like the drag of claws against the metal, but it grew louder. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and he rushed to the window but saw nothing outside. Just the dark, empty wilderness stretching beyond the perimeter. He was not alone. The next day, Carter began to notice other strange occurrences. Small things at first, like equipment being moved around in his lab, tools going missing, and strange, unexplainable marks on the walls of his facility. But when he checked the cameras, the footage was always corrupted, the footage cutting out just before anything significant happened. It was as if someone, or something, was deliberately hiding from him. Carter's paranoia grew as he began to dig deeper into his research. He combed through old files and records from past experiments conducted in the facility. What he found horrified him. The experiments hadn't just been focused on animal behavior, they were far darker. The scientists who had worked here years ago had been experimenting with animal and human DNA, combining the two in an attempt to create creatures that could move between worlds. They had been using the local wildlife as test subjects. The creatures were hybrids, part animal, part human, with the ability to shapeshift, to move between worlds, and to possess unimaginable strength. The deeper Carter dug, the more he uncovered about the experiments, the twisted goals of the research, the horrifying results, and the growing number of creatures that had been released into the wilderness. The Skinwalkers. They had not just been shapeshifters. They were something worse. The experiments had gone far beyond mere transformation. The creatures were being bred to infiltrate and dominate, to bend both the animal and human worlds to their will. The Skinwalkers had been designed to be more than just predators. They were hunters, using the world as their breeding ground, the research facility as their base of operations. Carter felt a wave of dread wash over him as the full scope of the nightmare hit him. These creatures were everywhere, watching him, studying him, waiting for the right moment to strike. They had been in the facility all along, hidden among the shadows. And now they were getting closer. The night that followed was the longest of Carter's life. He barricaded himself in his office, locking the doors and windows, listening to the sounds of the forest closing in on him. He could hear them moving outside, the unmistakable sounds of something large and heavy brushing against the walls. He knew they were coming for him. Carter grabbed what equipment he could find, anything that could be used as a weapon, and set out into the darkness, determined to stop the experiment before it could escape. But as he stepped into the hall, he was faced with the thing he had feared the most. The first creature appeared, its form shifting between human and something far more monstrous. Its eyes glowed in the dark, and its body was twisted, half animal, half human, a perfect creation of the nightmare the scientists had unleashed. Carter raised his weapon, but it was too late. The creature was upon him in an instant, its claws raking across his chest. He fought back with everything he had, but the creature was too strong, too fast. The facility groaned under the weight of what had been unleashed. The door to the outside world was open, and soon the horrors would be free to spread. Carter realized, with the last of his strength, that the transformation was already complete. The Skinwalkers had been waiting for this moment for years, and now they were free to escape into the world. And there was no one left to stop them. Story number 9, The Heart of the Forest. Lena Mitchell had always felt a deep connection to her younger sister Emily. They had been inseparable growing up, their bond unbreakable. But when Emily vanished without a trace one fateful night, everything changed. The police had searched for weeks, but there was no sign of her, no clues, no answers. It was as if she had simply disappeared into thin air, and then the whispers began. The small town of Black Hollow, where Lena and Emily had grown up, had always been a quiet place. Peaceful, even. But now, it seemed haunted by the mystery of Emily's disappearance. People started talking, their voices hushed in fear. They spoke of strange happenings in the forest, of things that couldn't be explained. Skinwalkers, they called them. Creatures that could take the form of any human or animal. Ancient beings that lived in the shadows of the woods. Lena had heard the stories growing up, but she had never believed them. Not until Emily went missing. Determined to find answers, Lena decided to take matters into her own hands. She couldn't rest knowing her sister was out there, somewhere, lost and alone. She packed her bags, gathered what little information she had, and made her way to the heart of the forest, where Emily had last been seen. The forest was dense, its trees towering high above her, their branches intertwining to block out the sunlight. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and as Lena walked deeper into the woods, she began to feel the weight of something watching her. She shook off the feeling, telling herself it was just the isolation playing tricks on her mind. But as the hours passed, she couldn't ignore the sense that something was wrong. Finally, she came upon an old, abandoned village. The buildings were decaying, their windows shattered and their doors hanging off their hinges. The place felt forgotten, left to rot by time and neglect. But there was something strange about it. The air was heavy, as if the village itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to uncover its secrets. Lena entered the village cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. She was drawn to a small cottage at the edge of the village, its door slightly ajar. Inside, she found a dusty old journal, its pages yellowed with age. The journal belonged to someone named Sarah, and as Lena flipped through its pages, she learned about the village's dark history. It told stories of a battle between humans and Skinwalkers, creatures that had once lived among the villagers, blending in with them, only to be driven out by fear and violence. But the Skinwalkers hadn't gone far. They had remained hidden, watching, waiting. The more Lena read, the more she realized that her sister's disappearance was no accident. Emily hadn't just wandered off into the woods, she had been taken, and the Skinwalkers were responsible. They had been hunting humans for centuries, using their ability to shapeshift to infiltrate towns and villages, blending in until they were ready to strike. Emily had become one of their victims, and now Lena was in danger too. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence, a rustling from behind her. Lena spun around, her heart racing. There, standing in the doorway of the cottage, was a figure. It looked familiar, too familiar. It was a woman, but not just any woman. It was Emily. Or at least, it looked like her, the same face, the same eyes, the same voice. "Lena," the figure whispered, a smile creeping onto its lips. "It's me. I've been waiting for you." Lena's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe it. Was this really Emily? Or was it the Skinwalker taking the form of her sister to lure her in? "Where's Emily?" Lena asked, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped closer, its eyes glinting with something dark, something ancient. Lena's instincts screamed at her to run, but she couldn't move. It was as if the creature's gaze had frozen her in place. "Don't you want to see her again?" the figure asked softly. "Don't you want to feel her warmth, her love?" Lena shook her head, fighting the urge to fall into the creature's trap. "No, you're not her." The figure's smile faded, and for a moment Lena saw something else. Something monstrous lurking beneath the surface of her sister's face. The Skinwalker had revealed its true form, its eyes now glowing with an unnatural light. It bared its teeth, and Lena knew, deep in her bones, that it wasn't just playing with her. It was hunting her. Without thinking, Lena grabbed the nearest object, a broken piece of wood from the cottage, and swung it at the creature. It staggered back, its form shifting and flickering between human and something else, something nightmarish. But it was enough to give Lena the chance she needed. She ran. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees growing taller and darker, their branches reaching out like clawed hands. She didn't know where she was going, but she had to escape. The Skinwalker was right behind her, its footsteps quick and heavy, its growls echoing through the woods. Lena's heart raced as she pushed forward, desperate to find a way out of the forest. But she knew she couldn't outrun the creature, not forever. It would find her. It always found its prey. And then, Just as Lena felt she could go no further, she stumbled upon the heart of the forest, the place where the Skinwalkers had once ruled, where the battle between man and monster had begun. The ground was marked with strange symbols, the air thick with an oppressive energy that made Lena's skin crawl. This was where it had all started, and this was where it would end. As the Skinwalker closed in on her, Lena realized the horrifying truth. The line between human and monster was not as clear as she thought. Her sister was gone, lost to the darkness of the forest, and now it was Lena's turn to become part of the nightmare. But she wouldn't go down without a fight. Story number 10. The Last Skinwalker. Sheriff Cole Harper had seen more than his share of death in the small town of Ridgeview. The kind of death that lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. But the deaths that had plagued the town for the past few years were different, mysterious, unexplained. And as time went on, they seemed to come in waves, always leaving more questions than answers. No one ever saw the killer, and there were never any solid clues. But Cole had his suspicions. Something dark, something ancient was behind it all. The first few deaths had been dismissed as accidents, but as they continued, it became harder to ignore the pattern. The victims were all found in the woods, ripped apart, their bodies twisted in unnatural ways. They looked like they'd been mauled by some wild animal, but none of the local wildlife matched the brutality of the attacks. There were no paw prints, no traces of blood in the woods, just the bodies, left to rot in the trees. A grim reminder that something was hunting the town. Cole had been chasing shadows for years, investigating without ever getting any closer to the truth. But when the most recent death occurred, it shook him to the core. A young woman named Emily Collins was found in the same manner as the others, her body mangled and discarded in the forest like a rag doll. But this time, something was different. When Cole examined the body, he found something that wasn't there before. An old symbol carved into the woman's arm. A mark that matched something he'd seen years ago in a dusty old journal at the town's library. The symbol was the same one his grandfather had warned him about, the one that his family had always feared. It was tied to an ancient curse, something that had haunted Ridgeview for generations. A creature that could shapeshift, take on any form, and blend into the very fabric of the town. The creature was known as a Skinwalker. Cole had heard the stories growing up, of course. He'd been told they were nothing more than local legends, the kind of tales that were shared around campfires to scare children. But as he stood in the cold forest, staring at the symbol on Emily's arm, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than he had ever known. Determined to find out what was really going on, Cole began digging deeper into the town's history. He revisited the old journal his grandfather had left behind, the one that spoke of a dark and twisted past. A past that had been carefully hidden from the town's residents for generations. The journal revealed the truth. The Skinwalker was not just a shapeshifter. It was an ancient being, born from a twisted pact between man and something far darker. The creature had been manipulating the town for centuries, feeding on its fear, its guilt, and its darkness. The Skinwalker had been responsible for every gruesome death that had ever occurred in Ridgeview, and it had been using the town as its hunting ground. It could take the form of anyone, a loved one, a friend, a neighbor, and no one would know it was the creature until it was too late. It had become a part of the town, a predator in the guise of a resident, feeding off the very people it claimed to protect. The more Cole uncovered, the more he realized that the Skinwalker was not just a monster from the past, it was connected to him. His own family had been marked by the curse, passed down through generations. His grandfather had fought against it, trying to protect the town, but had ultimately failed. The Skinwalker had been too strong, too cunning, and now it was Cole's turn to face it. As the days passed, the deaths continued, and the town became more paranoid. People started to question each other, to look over their shoulders, wondering who among them was the Skinwalker. But Cole knew the truth now. He wasn't just fighting a creature. He was fighting his own bloodline, his own legacy. He could feel the creature's presence lurking just beyond his sight, watching him. The Skinwalker had always been a part of him, and now it wanted to claim him. One night, after a long day of searching, Cole stood at the edge of the woods, staring into the darkness. He knew the creature was out there, waiting. It always was. The air around him was thick with dread, as if the very trees were holding their breath. He felt the cold, clammy fingers of fear creep up his spine, but he pushed it aside. He had to face this. He had no choice. Suddenly, he heard a rustling behind him, and he spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun, but there was no one there, only the darkness. Then a voice, a whisper, like the wind itself, called his name. Cole, it breathed, low and menacing. He froze. The voice was too familiar. It sounded like his father, who had disappeared years ago without a trace. The Skinwalker had taken his form, and now it was calling him to its side. Come closer, Cole, the voice beckoned. You know who I am. You know what I am. Cole's heart pounded in his chest. He raised his gun, his hands shaking. He could see the shadow now, moving in the darkness, shifting and changing as it took on different forms. It was the Skinwalker, and it was closing in. Don't run, Cole, the voice whispered again, now taking the form of his mother. We're family. We've always been family. Cole couldn't breathe. The creature was toying with him, pulling him into the darkness, trying to drag him into the nightmare that had haunted his family for generations. But Cole wasn't about to let it win. He knew what he had to do. With one final, desperate breath, he pulled the trigger. The darkness screamed as the Skinwalker writhed, its form unraveling, but it didn't disappear. It was still there in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. The fight wasn't over, and Cole knew that the last Skinwalker would never stop hunting him, or the town, until it had claimed everything.